Okay, I'm Father Andriy Chirovsky, the founder and first director of the Metropolitan Andrei Sheptitsky Institute of Eastern Christian Studies in the Faculty of Theology of the University of St. Michael's College in the University of Toronto, where I still teach. I'm also pastor of a tiny little Ukrainian Catholic parish, St. Michael's in Tucson, Arizona. So I have this life in these two countries, in the United States and Canada. And right now, as we know, for about the last 350 years, there's been some tension between two other countries, Ukraine and Russia, originally known as Muscovy. The whole problem starts when the Ukrainian Church, which had received the faith from Constantinople, so it regards Constantinople as its mother church, suffered much after the Mongol invasions in the middle of the 13th century, so much so that some of the elites moved north to Vladimir-on-Klyazma and then later to the rather young town of Moscow, and took shelter there. The Muscovites then suddenly started feeling that they were the inheritors of Kyivan tradition, of the history of Kyivan-Rus, of the Church of Kyivan-Rus, and anything that was actually happening in Kyiv was irrelevant, because now, in their eyes, everything had transferred northeast to the principality of Muscovy, which later became the Tsardom of Muscovy, which later changed its name in the early 18th century to Russia, taking that name of Kyivan-Rus and befuddling Western Europeans by calling themselves Russia, Russia. But the biggest problem is that Moscow, even later on in the 17th century, began to claim that it in fact is the mother church for the Church of Kyiv, which had its own hierarchy, reestablished, and which had a rather sizable church. And so here is the historical dilemma which lies at the heart of the problem. The Moscow Patriarchate, which came into existence in 1589, claims to be the mother church of the Church of Kyiv, which came into existence in the year 988. So we're talking 600 years difference in age. If anything, the Church of Moscow is the daughter church of the Church of Kyiv. But through geopolitical circumstances, since the late 17th century, Moscow has been able to exercise control over Ukrainian Orthodoxy. In the meantime, there were bishops and the Metropolitan of Kyiv who entered into communion with Rome, and that is what we call today the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church. Some call it the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, but that really is a mistranslation. It's the Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, because it has something to do with things Greek, because the faith came from Constantinople, but it is not a Greek church. So it's a Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church. It's Ukrainian Orthodoxy in communion with Rome. But a lot of Ukrainian Orthodox did not follow or accept this, and so a separate hierarchy was established for them a generation later, and so you have a Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church, you have a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and then you have the Patriarchate of Moscow, which begins to extend its control into, first of all, left bank Ukraine, that is the part of Ukraine which is to the east of the Dnipro River. And then later, through successive acquisitions of territory, it acquires the vast majority of Ukraine and Belarus. And so the Church of Kyiv, which was the Church of Ukraine and Belarus, now wind up under the power of the Moscow Tsars, and because of that, under the authority of the Moscow Patriarchs. But the Ukrainian Greco-Catholics never were under the Moscow Patriarchate. Ukrainian Orthodox did wind up, sadly, under the ecclesiastical control of their hostile northeastern neighbors. But the fact remains that the true mother church of the Church of Kyiv is the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. And Ukrainian Greco-Catholics and most Ukrainian Orthodox recognize that this is the only sane way to interpret history. Because how can a daughter, Moscow, be her own mother's mother? It just, it makes sense to anyone who looks at it reasonably, except, of course, to the Moscow Patriarchate and to the state power behind the Moscow Patriarchate, the Putin regime. So, Ukrainian Orthodox have been trying to get out from under this Muscovite, this Russian control of their church for quite a while. In 1921, the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church was created. In the diaspora, various Ukrainian Orthodox jurisdictions were created that did not recognize the authority of the Moscow Patriarchate. They later aligned themselves clearly under the omophorion of the Patriarch of Constantinople, which again makes perfect historical sense. In 1992, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kyivan Patriarchate was established, and it also said it's time for Ukraine to have its own native Orthodox Church. And so it did not accept the jurisdiction of Moscow. Moscow, on the other hand, did not accept the legitimacy, the canonical status of either of these Ukrainian Orthodox churches. And so in the last decades, this struggle has been going on over who will reign over Ukrainian Orthodoxy in Ukraine. Because, as I said, in the diaspora, both the Church in the United States and the Church in Canada have aligned themselves very clearly with the Patriarchate of Constantinople. And so Moscow has nothing to say about their church. But Moscow has been telling the world and telling all of the other autocephalous Orthodox churches that these independently minded Ukrainian Orthodox churches are schismatics, they're troublemakers, they have no grace, their church is not valid, and that they should be rejected. There have been several efforts to turn to the Patriarch of Constantinople, who is the first among all Orthodox hierarchs. He's the first among the patriarchs in the Orthodox Christian community. To turn to him to resolve this issue. But the issue did not come to resolution in the last couple of decades because it was proposed as a dissolution of the Moscow Patriarchate's structures in Ukraine, or a forcing of the Moscow Patriarchate's parishes and monasteries to join this proposed Ukrainian Orthodox Church, with being under the omophorion of Constantinople and receiving a tomos of autocephaly from Constantinople. But in recent months, a novel approach has been attempted, and that is that the president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, and the parliament of Ukraine, the Verkhovna Rada, appealed to Constantinople and presented documents in which the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church's hierarchy and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kyivan Patriarchate's hierarchy both agree to be united into one Ukrainian Orthodox Church, receiving autocephaly from Constantinople, and with the proviso that if people in Ukraine want to remain under the Moscow Patriarchate and have parishes, monasteries, or schools under the Moscow Patriarchate, that they would be allowed to do so, which is very reasonable in a modern, pluralistic country in which there is no established church. It is kind of a tongue-in-cheek saying that in the Soviet Union, the Moscow Patriarchate, the Russian Orthodox Church, was the closest thing to an established state church in an officially atheist country. But really, these are all incredible paradoxes about whose mother, whether you can speak of a state church, an established church in the Soviet Union, which was an atheist country. These are all very strange things, and they're all due to all kinds of geopolitical machinations on the part of a revanchist Russian regime which would love to reestablish the Russian Empire in its former boundaries, in the Soviet Union's former boundaries, or perhaps even greater than that. And also due to the fact that, unfortunately, there is also ecclesiastical politics. And the ecclesiastical politics in question revolve around who should be the leading voice in worldwide Christian Orthodoxy. Now, by tradition, it is the Ecumenical Patriarch, the Patriarch of Constantinople, currently Patriarch Bartholomew. But Moscow has been arguing that because the Russian Orthodox Church is the largest in size of all the Orthodox churches, and also the wealthiest, and because it has the next best thing to a Tsar, in the person of Vladimir Putin, that it's Moscow that should lead the way. And we saw this play out very, very clearly when the Orthodox churches of the world attempted to hold what one might call an ecumenical council, and that is the Great and Holy Synod that took place in Crete in 2016. Everyone was agreed. All of the documents were agreed upon beforehand that would be issued by this Great and Holy Synod. All the heads of all the Orthodox churches had agreed upon the agenda, all the content, who would be allowed to attend, how the churches would be represented. Everything was agreed upon in advance in order to avoid any last-minute confusion. And yet, at the very last minute, the Patriarchate of Moscow, the Russian Orthodox Church, and some of its allies, plus also one of the Middle Eastern Orthodox churches, decided not to show up. And this was clearly a power play between Moscow and Constantinople. Even Patriarch Kirill's Havana airport meeting with Pope Francis, a strange place for these two Christian leaders to meet in an officially communist country, and at an airport, not in a church or a monastery, but in an airport. What was that all about? That was the same game, because Patriarch Bartholomew has excellent relations with Pope Francis. And let's face it, Pope Francis heads a church, a communion of churches, really, a communion of 24 churches, that numbers 1.15 billion with a B faithful. All of the Orthodox churches of the world together, it's hard to, they don't have good statistics, but probably number at best 300 to 400 million. So having a good relationship with the most authoritative Christian leader in the world, the Pope of Rome, is an advantage when you are dealing with a power play in the Orthodox world. Patriarch Bartholomew was at Pope Francis's enthronement. He's there often in Rome. They have an excellent relationship. In order to catch up with that, the Patriarch of Moscow, who for decades said that he couldn't possibly meet with the Pope of Rome, even though Pope John Paul II almost begged for a meeting, he couldn't possibly meet because, especially because of those Ukrainian Greco-Catholics who were troublemakers. Suddenly, Pope Kirill can meet with the Pope of Rome. What is that about? That's about playing catch-up to the Patriarch of Constantinople. So now we have this situation. We have a geopolitical problem, the Russia-Ukraine problem. There's currently a war in eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian territory of the Crimean Peninsula has been annexed by the Russian Federation. So we have that going on. We have the Moscow Patriarchate, which has never condemned Russian incursions into Ukraine. Oh, they talk about peace a lot, but they never mention that the Ukrainians have never attacked Russia. It's Russia that has attacked Ukraine, stolen Ukrainian territory, and is currently waging a hybrid war in eastern Ukraine. So we have that going on, and we have this power struggle between Constantinople and Moscow. So what we have is the National Catholic Register, the authoritative mainstream Catholic newspaper in the United States, runs a major, rather lengthy article on this whole issue. And Peter Jesserer Smith, the author, really did his homework. And he interviewed me for a couple of hours. He interviewed Father Kirill of Moscow, who is from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. He interviewed a number of people. He did a lot of background work to try to understand the issue. And I think he did a reasonably good job for an outsider in trying to piece all of this together. So it is the hope of millions of Ukrainian Orthodox in Ukraine that do not want to be under the jurisdiction of the Moscow Patriarchate, which supports the Russian regime that is waging war against Ukraine. It is their hope that the tomos of autocephaly will come soon from Constantinople. There's even talk that it might happen during the month of July this year. Well, we've seen those kind of hopes dashed in the past. But the great difference, as I mentioned earlier, is the fact that today no one is telling those people who want to remain under Moscow's jurisdiction that they would have to join this Ukrainian Autocephalous Church. They could be left in peace. And a solution could be found for the Ukrainian Orthodox. However, the problem is that many fear that if Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople does actually issue a tomos of autocephaly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, that this could cause a major schism between Constantinople and Moscow. Let's face it, Moscow stands to lose at least half of the faithful that they claim, because they usually claim all the Orthodox in Ukraine as part of their church. Some of them are temporarily misguided and following these schismatic, uncanonical structures, but they like to claim all of that in order to inflate the size of the Moscow Patriarchate. Another thing that the Moscow Patriarchate does is it does not actually count the number of faithful who identify with the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. It counts the number of parishes and other ecclesiastical institutions. And it has many more of those than the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kyivan Patriarchate, or of course the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, which is much, much smaller. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kyivan Patriarchate, and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, they both count the number of faithful. And the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kyivan Patriarchate, has by far more adherents than the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. But, you know, there was this saying that there are lies, there are damned lies, and then there are statistics. And that's what we have here. Another game, a power play using numbers. Who's the more significant church? But there is also the question of whether the Ecumenical Patriarch, the Patriarch of Constantinople, can act unilaterally in presenting this tomos of autocephaly. And there, Orthodox thought is divided. There are those who say, no, first he should seek consensus from the various Orthodox churches, and then grant a tomos of autocephaly. The fact is that there are a number of Orthodox churches that did not become autocephalous in that fashion. They just organically developed, and they had the good fortune of not being next door to Russia and not having Russia think of the church as its last bastion for soft power in Ukraine. So those churches were able to become autocephalous without a consensus. As a matter of fact, the Russian Orthodox Church proclaimed its autocephaly and was out of communion with the rest of the Orthodox world because they did this unilaterally. They were out of communion with the rest of the Orthodox world for a century and a half. And they now have the gall to say, but the Ukrainians cannot do what Moscow did. And furthermore, the spiritual leader of worldwide Orthodoxy, the Patriarch of Constantinople, cannot unilaterally solve this crisis in Ukraine. Because just imagine, theologically speaking, if indeed, from the point of view of the Moscow Patriarchate, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Kyivan Patriarchate, and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church do not possess any grace. Their sacraments are completely invalid. Their adherents are destined really for hell. Wouldn't one want to resolve this problem somehow so that grace could again abound? And I think that if Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople does make a unilateral move, or a move with the support of some of the autocephalous Orthodox churches, but not all, that he will be doing it for precisely this reason: pastoral care for the faithful in Ukraine who are caught in a terrible situation. He wants them to be convinced that the church that they belong to is in fact in a state of grace and can impart divine grace and bring people into the kingdom of God, into salvation in our Lord Jesus Christ. That would be the motivation. Although Moscow will scream to highest heaven that it's a power play against it. Just as a Ukrainian independence, the Maidan, this is all a power play by the West and probably by the CIA and Washington against the Russians. No, just as the Ukrainian people deserve to have dignity, and that's what the revolution of dignity was all about, the Maidan. And it's not about foreign powers, it's about a people deserving dignity. So also the faithful, Ukrainian Orthodox faithful, deserve to have a church that is recognized by other Orthodox churches and is in communion with them and can normally live its life without constantly being hounded by a much more wealthy and much more powerful Patriarchate of Moscow. So that's what's going on.